In this lesson, we're going to create our first Next.js app together. We're going to look at some config options when we're running the install script. Then we're going to look at our project structure from a high level to understand files and folders and conventions in the app router. We're going to briefly talk about Tailwind and install a plugin to make writing Tailwind easier and more. So let's get into it. Now, throughout the course, I'm going to reference Next.js documentation a lot, so you can access it at nextjs.org, go up to the docs, and as you can see, the app router documentation is now merged back into the initial stable documentation. You have this toggle up top, which it allows you to toggle between the pages router and the app router. And for some time, we have to cross-reference concepts between the pages router and the app router. The majority of Next.js apps out there would still be using the Next.js 12 pages router. With the stability that was marked in Next.js 13.4, I'm expecting more apps to be migrating to the app router or be nearly created in the app router. But nevertheless, if you're using the documentation, make sure that you are in the correct toggle over here. Now, if you head down to the installation, we can see this automatic installation script we can run by create next app. If you like to use npm package manager, you can run npx create next app. I personally like to use pnpm package manager, so I would just run pnpx create next, if I can spell, app, and then I'm going to pass in the latest flag so I get the latest version of Next.js. Now, I have gone ahead and created this next starter folder, so I'm going to have to just pass in a dot representing the current working directory. You can just pass in this script on its own, and it would then ask you what you want to name your project. It would then go ahead and create that folder for you, or you can just pass in whatever name you want over here, and is again going to create this folder for you. For me, I've already created the folder, so I'm passing in the dot or period that represents the current working directory. This is going to ask me some config options on how I want to initialize my Next.js project. Now, the first question is whether or not I want to use TypeScript. For now, we're going to keep it simple. We have a module and lesson coming up talking about incorporating TypeScript into Next.js 13. For now, we'll keep it simple. ESLint we're going to use. Now, the nice thing is that Tailwind CSS is now one of the options or the default option to style your Next.js 13 app. So I'm going to select yes. The next option is whether or not we want to use the source directory. Some developers prefer to have all of their apps and components and utilities and libraries inside of a source directory. It's a matter of a personal preference. I don't like it. I don't use the source directory. It's up to you. And now the app router, which is the recommended way of building Next.js 13 apps, we're going to select yes. And then the last thing is if we wanted to use any import aliases, I'm going to select yes, and then the @ sign would be okay for it. As I mentioned, this is going to go ahead and install all the dependencies from where we can just jump in to the code and take a look at the structure of our application from a high level. So let me just clear this out and open up our folders over here. So let's look at our project structure from a high level. Up top, you can see this app folder, which represents our app router. There's two important files inside of it. One is layout.js and page.js. Let's start with the layout.js. I usually like to rename these guys to JSX and page. Let me just do that quickly before actually talking about them. Let's just go back to the layout. Let me close this off and maybe make this a bit smaller so that we have more room over here. Now, the first thing is the root layout of your app. It has two required tags, the HTML and the body tag, which wraps your whole app. As you can see, if you're passing these children props to it, these are going to be your React server components or your page components plugged into this layout. So this is the main root layout or outermost layout of your application. Now, we're going to build on top of this root layout throughout this course. But for the starter, this is the bare minimum layout that your whole site will share. Now, I'm going to touch on the font and metadata briefly right now, but we're going to dive deeper in both of these concepts later on in separate dedicated modules. Now, as you can see, we are using the new Next font package up top and the inter font. This allows you to create a font and pass it to your body, so your whole site is now using the inter font. This package allows you to use any of the Google fonts or even a local font, which we're going to explain later on in the course. Now this metadata object is using the new metadata API in NextJS 13. Again, this is something that we're going to cover later on in the course. Now let's just dive into the page and actually see what we're dealing with over here. So if I run the development server real quick over here by running pm run or pm dev, I would be able to access the project on my local host port 3000. So as you can see here, the content of this page is represented by this React component that we are exporting from this page.jsx. And if I just replace this with a simpler section, maybe a div with a container class that we'll add together in a second, I'm going to add an h1 with a text, maybe 3XL and a font bold to say this is a NextJS 13 starter kit. Let's just save this and see the changes that we have over here. Now we have to change the config of our Tailwind CSS. Before I get there, let me just eliminate this image. We are not using it. Let me just also add a little padding over here. Nothing fancy. For now, we're just changing the content of our homepage. With this, the container class doesn't work. And I'm going to show it to you how you can add or extend the options in your Tailwind CSS. So in your project, as you can see, you have this tailwind config.js. This is something that was installed for us by the script that we ran, and we selected to have Tailwind CSS. So I'm going to delete the extension that the NextJS team had added here. I'm not actually using it. Let me just add the container class that I just mentioned. So with this container class, all it does is that you can just pass it to your elements like this div. So it acts as a container class with a specific width, and it just centers that div. Now that we've removed the content of our homepage, let's actually go to our global CSS. This is where you would write your global CSS. Let me just delete everything that the boilerplate came with. Right now, we only have the Tailwind CSS directives to reset the styling of our browser and add the components and utilities coming from Tailwind CSS. So let's just actually talk about this too. So this is where you would write your global CSS. We're going to dive into styling in NextJS 13 in the next lesson. But for now, this is where we're going to add our Tailwind CSS directives, and we're actually importing this global CSS into our layout. So it is going to affect all of our application over here. Now that we're talking about Tailwind, let me just show you a plugin that I typically use with Prettier. So if you open this up, you can see this is a Prettier plugin that allows you to sort Tailwind classes in a specific way. We're going to see this in action in a second. Let me just go ahead and install these dependencies. Just stop the dev server for a second over here and run pm add. And as a dev dependency, we're going to add Prettier. And we're going to add this Prettier plugin Tailwind CSS, which just sorts your Tailwind classes in a specific order every time. So as you're adding classes to your elements, or as other developers are working together, it always sorts the Tailwind classes in the same order. So you always know where to expect what in terms of margins, paddings, and colors and whatnot. So I find it easier to work with that. So let me just rerun the dev server. For that to work, we have to add a Prettier RC to our project. Bear with me for a second. Okay, so inside the root of our application, we're going to create a .prettier RC file, and inside of it, I'm just going to pass in some options. You can just play around with these options in terms of single quotes and the tab width and whatnot. But you have to include this Prettier plugin Tailwind CSS as a plugin to your Prettier RC. If you're using PM package manager, if you're using npm or yarn, you don't have to do this. But with PM, you do have to pass this in for it to take effect. So for example, if I now go back ahead and save, first of all, it's going to change the way that we are kind of formatting the code, because I now have a Prettier RC overtaking the default settings that I had in my VS Code. So this project has its own setting for how I want to format the code. And if I, let's say, add a margin top, just to show you, add a margin top of 4 to the end of the classes here, you see once I save, this margin top 4 jumps to the beginning. So every time you're adding margin, it's going to be always in the beginning. This over time helps you find your Tailwind classes faster, because you get used to where you would usually see margin, padding, height, width, and whatnot. Now we briefly covered the app folder, the layout, and the page inside of it. We're going to dive deeper into this concept later on in the course. For now, we have a high-level understanding of our project structure. Now let's also talk about other files and folders in our project. The node modules is where your dependencies are installed. The public folder is any static image or asset that you have is going to be served statically on your site at your homepage. So for example, we have this vercel.svg here. I can go to my project, and at the root, I can just access this vercel.svg to get that static file. Now eslint.json is your eslint config. Gitignore is for your git config or the files you want git to ignore. Prettier RC is what we just added. This is how we would like to format our code. JSConfig is your JSConfig options. If you're running or using TypeScript, you would have a tsconfig over here. Next.config.js, this is your NextJs config. Before, if you remember, or if you've used the app router before it was stable, we had this experimental flag added to our Next.js config over here, which we no longer need for the app router. We're going to need it for server actions when we talk about mutation. I'll show it to you then, but for now, let's just keep it at that. Package.json, we can see our dependencies over here and our main scripts running. Now the dev is what we have already run together by running pnpm run or npm run dev. This runs a local development server that allows you to run your project locally, just as we did here, make changes and see the results refreshing on the browser live. The build script is for you to build a production ready bundle of your application and then host it or serve it up. The start is going to be running a production server, not a development server, but a production server that serves up that build folder. Lint is for next lint, running or configuring your ESLint, and then your regular dependencies and dev dependencies over here. We have the pnpm lock. This is working with your package manager. You might have yarn or npm specific files over here. Now post-CSS config is working together with Tailwind, and then the Tailwind config we already mentioned. Now this is where you can work with your Tailwind config, extend its utilities and classes, or add plugins to it. Now that's a wrap for this video. I'm going to include the finished version of this project we built together on my GitHub repo, so you can use it as a next starter kit anytime you wanted to start a new project that's configured to work with Tailwind and it's free of the clutter. You could use that. In the next lesson, we're going to dive a bit deeper into styling, into Tailwind CSS and other options for styling if you don't like to use Tailwind CSS. So see you in the next lesson. Bye-bye.